She was 5 years old, and she had a way of walking that everyone who knew her mentioned without being asked, a particular bounce in her step, both heels lifting slightly before the toe came down, as if the ground beneath her was always about to become something more interesting. On the morning of August 14th, 1964, Ruby Lane left the front porch of her family's house on Birchwood Street, in the small manufacturing town of Owasso, Michigan, population 17,000, carrying a paper bag with a peanut butter sandwich inside, and walked 3 houses down to her best friend Norma's yard, where the two of them had been building something in the dirt all week. A city, they called it, with stick roads and bottle-cap buildings, and a mayor who was a smooth gray stone they had named Gerald. At 11:20 that morning, Norma's mother called the girls in for lunch. Norma came inside. Ruby did not. Norma's mother looked out the kitchen window. The yard was empty. The paper bag was on the ground beside the bottle-cap city. The mayor was still in his place. Ruby Lane was gone. That is not a story about a little girl who wandered off. That is a story about what a community buries when it cannot bear to look, and what rises 60 years later from the ground it was buried in. And it would take 6 decades, a construction crew breaking ground on a new water line on Birchwood Street in the summer of 2023, and a forensic genealogy laboratory in Lansing to finally give Ruby Lane back her name and her family back their answer. But before we get to what the construction crew found 3 feet below the surface of a yard that had changed hands 4 times since 1964, we have to go back to that August morning. Because to understand what was taken from the Lane family in the summer of 1964, you first have to understand who Ruby was, and how far a town will go to protect one of its own. Owasso sat on the Shiawassee River in mid-Michigan, a town built on manufacturing and the particular pride of a working community that made things, castles of industry. The locals sometimes called the brick factory buildings along the river, and sent them out into the country. The Garwood Industries plant had put the town on the map. The Thomas Edison connection, his wife was from Owasso, gave it a certain cultural self-satisfaction that the locals wore lightly and the outsiders found charming. In 1964, it was a town of union men and church suppers and summer evenings on front porches, where the milkman still came on Tuesdays, and the Shiawassee County Fair was the event around which the entire August calendar organized itself. Eugene and Helen Lane had lived on Birchwood Street since 1958, when Eugene took a position at the Owasso manufacturing plant, and they moved from Bay City with their 2 children. Ruby's older brother, Thomas, who was 9, and Ruby herself, just 2 years old. Eugene was a floor supervisor at the plant, a careful and deliberate man who measured twice and cut once in everything he did. Helen kept the house, attended St. Paul's Lutheran Church every Sunday, and was the kind of neighbor who noticed when someone's porch light had been on too many nights in a row and knocked on the door to ask if everything was all right. They were ordinary people, in the specific, unrepeatable way that the word ordinary, applied to a family that has lost a child, eventually becomes inadequate. Ruby was 5.5, the half mattered. She was clear about this, with dark hair in 2 braids that Helen redid every morning, and dark eyes that her grandmother had called. In a phrase Ruby's mother never forgot, eyes that are thinking about something they haven't told you yet. She attended the kindergarten program at Washington Elementary School, and had recently become interested in the question of where worms went when it wasn't raining, a topic she raised at dinner with a regularity that her father received with patience, and her brother with increasing exasperation. She was the kind of child who made adults feel that they were being paid attention to more carefully than they were used to. Her Sunday school teacher at St. Paul's told investigators, in the days after she disappeared, that Ruby was the only 5-year-old she had ever taught who remembered the previous week's lesson without being reminded. The man who lived 4 houses down from the Lane family was named Harold Greer. He was 41 years old in the summer of 1964, a widower since 1961 who worked as a maintenance supervisor at the same plant as Eugene Lane, though on a different shift, and who was known on Birchwood Street as a quiet neighbor, polite enough, helpful when asked, the kind of man you waved at from the car without specifically thinking about. He had no children. He kept his yard well. He had a dog named Pepper that the neighborhood children sometimes petted through the fence. Ruby Lane had petted Pepper through Harold Greer's fence on multiple occasions. Her mother knew this. She had watched it from the porch. It had never seemed like anything other than what it was, a small girl and a dog on a summer afternoon. On the morning of August 14, 1964, Harold Greer was not at work. He had called in sick to the plant that morning. 2 of his colleagues later confirmed this to investigators. He was home. His shift would have started at 7. He was at home on Birchwood Street when Ruby Lane walked out of Norma's yard and disappeared. He was never questioned about it. The Owasso Police Department responded to Helen Lane's call at 11:34 a.m. Officer Dale Riggs arrived at Norma's yard at 11:41 and found exactly what he had been told. The paper bag, the bottle cap city, the gray stone mare. He noted the yard's boundaries, a low hedge on the south side, a wooden fence on the north, the open front facing Birchwood Street. He noted that the gate in the fence on the north side was unlatched. He did not note what was on the other side of that fence. He called for backup at 11:43. By 1 in the afternoon, the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department had joined the search. By 3, volunteers from the neighborhood were walking the blocks between Birchwood Street and the Shiawassee River. By evening, the search had expanded to the riverbanks and the fairgrounds, which were being set up for the county fair that would open in 2 weeks. Ruby was not found that day. She was not found the following day. She was not found in the week of organized searching that followed, or in the months of diminishing effort that came after. What investigators had in the first 48 hours was the unlatched fence gate, a single adult boot print in the dirt near the base of the gate, consistent with a size 9 or 10, and the testimony of a 7-year-old named Norma Biggs, who told a police officer that Ruby had said she was going to look at Pepper before they came inside for lunch. Norma had been looking at a book on the porch and had not seen Ruby leave the yard. She had heard nothing. The detective assigned to the case was a man named Howard Birch, 12 years with the Owasso Police Department. He was competent and thorough and operating in August 1964, with the investigative resources available to a mid-sized Michigan city in August 1964. A small department, no forensic laboratory, no centralized missing children database, no interagency coordination protocol. He canvassed Birchwood Street on August 15th and 16th, interviewing every resident he could reach. He interviewed Harold Greer on August 16, 1964. Greer said he had been homesick. He said he had not seen Ruby that morning. He said he had heard the sirens in the afternoon and assumed it was something on the main road. He was calm. He was cooperative. He offered to join the volunteer search. His yard was not searched. The boot print near the fence gate was photographed and measured. The fence itself was not examined for trace evidence. The concept of trace evidence collection as a systematic practice had not yet penetrated the procedural standards of most municipal police departments in 1964. Howard Birch did what Howard Birch knew how to do in 1964, and what he knew how to do was not enough. By November of 1964, the Ruby Lane case had no active leads, no identified suspect, and no body. It was listed as an open missing persons case and assigned to the department's cold file. Howard Birch retired in 1971. The file passed to two subsequent detectives over the following decades, each of whom reviewed it, found nothing new to pursue, and noted its continued open status. Eugene Lane died of a heart attack in 1979. Thomas Lane, who had been 9 years old on the morning his sister walked out of Norma's yard, grew up, moved to Grand Rapids, married, had 3 daughters, the eldest of whom he named Ruby, and called the Owasso Police Department every year on August 14th for 41 years. Harold Greer had remained on Birchwood Street until 1971, when he sold his house and moved to Saginaw. He died in a Saginaw nursing facility in 1997 at the age of 74. His death was not connected, at any point during his lifetime, to the disappearance of Ruby Lane. Helen Lane had moved from the Birchwood Street house in 1981, 17 years after Ruby disappeared. When the upkeep became too much for her alone, and Thomas arranged for her to live closer to him in Grand Rapids. She was not certain, she told a reporter in 1989, that she had ever stopped looking at the house on the way out, looking back over her shoulder as the car pulled away. She had been in that house when Ruby was 5. She had watched her from the porch. The porch was still there. She looked at it for the last time through the rear window of Thomas's car and did not know, could not have known, that the answer was still on that street, that it had never left. The house on Birchwood Street changed hands in 1981, 1989, 1997, and 2008. Each family painted it, planted different things in the yard, replaced the porch boards, added a carport. The neighborhood changed around it in the ways mid-Michigan neighborhoods change across 4 decades. Some houses better maintained, some worse. The elm trees that had lined the street gone now after Dutch elm disease came through in the 1970s. Harold Greer's house, 4 doors down, had been a rental property since 1971 and showed it. In the spring of 2023, the city of Owasso undertook a water main replacement project on Birchwood Street, a long-deferred infrastructure improvement that required excavation along the length of the block. The crew began work on June 5, 2023. They worked from the east end of the block westward, replacing a cast-iron main that had been in the ground since 1948. On June 19, 2023, the excavation reached the section of the block between the house that had belonged to Harold Greer and the property line to the north. At a depth of approximately 3 feet, a crew member's shovel struck something that was not pipe and was not rock. The crew stopped work. The foreman made a call. The Owasso Police Department arrived within 20 minutes. What the crew had found, in the ground beneath what had once been Harold Greer's side yard, was subsequently identified by the Shiawassee County Medical Examiner as the partial skeletal remains of a child. Small-boned. Estimated age at death, 5 to 7 years. The remains were transported to the State Forensic Laboratory in Lansing on June 20, 2023. The Shiawassee County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit was notified. A detective named Sergeant Patricia Odom, 42 years old, was assigned the case. She opened the Ruby Lane file the same afternoon. She cross-referenced the address of the excavation site against the original 1964 canvas records. The excavation had taken place on a property that, in August 1964, had been owned by Harold Vincent Greer, maintenance supervisor, same plant as Eugene Lane. Known to the neighborhood, known to Ruby. Never questioned about his yard. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now let's get back to Ruby. The forensic identification process required DNA comparison. The remains were 60 years old, buried in Michigan soil through 60 winters. The State Forensic Laboratory worked the sample through 3 separate extraction protocols before obtaining a viable partial profile in August 2023. Sergeant Odom had located Thomas Lane through the department's records. His annual August 14th calls were documented in the case log going back to 1982, the year the department transitioned to a telephone log system. She called his home in Grand Rapids on the morning of July 3, 2023, before the DNA results were in, to inform him that remains had been found and that an identification process was underway. Thomas Lane was 68 years old. He had been making that phone call every August for 41 years. He listened to what Odom told him, and then he said, "Is it her?" Odom told him they did not know yet. He said, "It's her. I've always known she was on that street." He provided a DNA sample by mail kit the following week. The comparison results were confirmed on September 12, 2023. The partial skeletal remains found at 3 feet below the surface of Harold Greer's former side yard on Birchwood Street, Owasso, Michigan, were identified as those of Ruby Catherine Lane, age 5, who had walked out of her best friend's yard on the morning of August 14, 1964, carrying a paper bag with a peanut butter sandwich inside, looking for a dog named Pepper. She had never left the block. Sergeant Odom and the Shiawassee County Prosecutor's Office spent the subsequent 3 months building the evidentiary case against Harold Greer, who had been dead since 1997. Court documents filed in connection with the posthumous closure investigation show that investigators recovered from a storage unit associated with Greer's estate, which had passed to a distant cousin and remained uncleared since his death. A collection of personal diaries and correspondence spanning 1955 to 1996. Within those diaries, in entries dated August 1964, were references that investigators and a forensic document examiner assessed as consistent with knowledge of Ruby Lane's fate. The entries were oblique, not confessions in the explicit sense, but the kind of carefully maintained ambiguity that a careful man maintains across a lifetime. They also recovered, from a box in the same storage unit, a single item that had been kept for 59 years, a child's hair ribbon. Red, small, tied in a bow that had long since lost its shape. Helen Lane had told investigators in August 1964 that Ruby had been wearing a red ribbon in her left braid on the morning she disappeared. The right braid ribbon, she had explained, had come loose the night before and been lost in the yard. Only the left one, Harold Greer, had kept it for 59 years. The Shiawassee County Prosecutor's Office formally closed the Ruby Lane case as a solved homicide in December 2023. With Harold Greer identified as the perpetrator, deceased, there was no arrest. There was no trial. There was no sentencing. Greer had died in 1997 in a nursing facility in Saginaw, and the law cannot follow a man past that door. What the law could do, and did, was say the name. In the formal closure document filed December 14, 2023, the case of Ruby Catherine Lane is listed as solved, perpetrator identified, case closed. Her name is in the record now not as a question, but as an answer. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, the most the law had to offer. And the Lane family accepted it. Ruby Lane would have been 65 years old this year. The bottle cap city she and Norma built in the summer of 1964. The stick roads, the smooth gray stone mare named Gerald, is as gone as everything else from that August. Norma Biggs, who is now Norma Peterson and lives in Howell, Michigan, was reached by a Shiawassee County journalist in the weeks following the case closure, and said that she had thought about Ruby her entire life, and that she was glad, in a way that she found difficult to make fully articulate, to know that she had not wandered off. "I knew she wouldn't just leave," Norma said. "She never left anything unfinished. The city wasn't done yet." Thomas Lane attended the formal case closure proceeding in December 2023 with his wife and 3 daughters. His eldest daughter, Ruby, was 31 years old. He has said publicly that he does not know what to do with the fact that the answer was on the block the whole time, that his father drove past it for years, that his mother looked back at it from the car window in 1981, that the excavation that found her had been scheduled and deferred and rescheduled for a decade before the city finally funded it. He has said he is going to take some time before he decides how to feel about that. Helen Lane died in 2015 at the age of 87 in a memory care facility in Grand Rapids, having spent the last 4 years of her life in a state in which the world around her had become uncertain and unreliable. She did not live to see the excavation. She did not live to hear her daughter's name spoken as an answer. Thomas has said that this is the part he is not sure how to carry, not the grief for Ruby, which he has been carrying for 60 years and knows the shape of, but the grief for his mother, who waited and did not get to know. The red ribbon is in the custody of the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department, logged as evidence in a closed case. What happens to it now is a question that the Lane family and the department are in discussion about. Thomas Lane has said that he would like to have it, that it was Ruby's and it should come home. There is a version of this case that ends in 1997 when Harold Greer dies in Saginaw, and in that version, Ruby Lane is still a question mark, still a 5-year-old in a file, still the child who walked out of a yard one August morning and was never found. What prevented that version from being the only version was a cast-iron water main installed in 1948 that finally failed badly enough in 2023 for the city to pay to replace it. Infrastructure, maintenance, the ordinary administrative decision to fund a repair that had been deferred for 10 years. Justice sometimes arrives by appointment. Sometimes it arrives because a pipe finally breaks. Ruby Lane came home after 60 years. She came home 3 feet below the street she had lived on, in ground that had been walked over and driven over and played over for 6 decades by people who did not know what it held. She came home because the city of Owasso replaced a water main, and because a forensic laboratory in Lansing had learned, in 60 years, things that no laboratory in 1964 could have known. And because a detective named Patricia Odom read a 60-year-old canvas report and noticed that the yard of a man who had called in sick and who owned a dog that Ruby Lane was known to visit had never been searched. She was 5 years old, and she had a way of walking, both heels lifting slightly before the toe came down, as if the ground beneath her was always about to become something more interesting. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you make of the fact that the original investigator in 1964, operating with the tools, training, and protocols of that era, interviewed Harold Greer and searched everywhere except his yard? Is that a failure of the individual, the institution, or the time? How do you reckon with the knowledge that Helen Lane spent the last years of her life in a memory care facility without ever knowing what happened to Ruby, and that her son now has to hold both the resolution and the grief that his mother didn't get to share it? And what does it mean that justice, in a case like this one, is a document filed in a courthouse naming a dead man as the perpetrator? Is that justice? And if not, what word do we use instead? Leave your thoughts below. Ruby Lane came home after 60 years because a water main broke and someone finally searched the right yard. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.